Hiya Monstaz and welcome! For tonight, I have 5 really weird, kinda gory funeral stories. Have you ever wondered what goes on behind the doors in a funeral home? What are your thoughts about being embalmed? Be sure to leave those comments below. Well Monstaz, be sure to hold on to your teddy and let the stories begin. The night I crashed. It was a late night of being on call. It had been quiet most of the night. I had just gotten to bed for the night when the on-call cell phone began to chirp. I flipped open the cell phone and spoke to the call service representative who had taken the call and had contacted me. She told me there was a pickup at a local nursing home. I got out of bed and put on my suit, and grabbed my keys and headed out to the white, unmarked funeral van. It was very late at night. No one was out on the road, so my commute to the nursing home was quite simple. I went in and told the receptionist who I was and why I was there. She pointed to the room 134 just down the hall. I rolled my gurney down the quiet, fluorescent-lit hallway. The door was open on room 134. The room was dimly lit, and the body of an elderly lady lay peacefully in the bed. I put her on the gurney and rolled her out. As I was lifting the gurney into the van, the cell phone chirped again. Death was coming alive in the wee hours of the morning. I answered the call. Another body to be picked up, this one at a local hospital morgue. I drove the van to the hospital, pulled around to the back loading dock where the hospital preferred us to enter and exit. They always said that funeral vans being loaded in the front of the building for all to see was bad for business. This was more of a covert operation. I made sure to lock the van while I went inside. Since there was a dead body in the van, it was precious cargo to some family who would be pleased to know I was locking it up while unattended. I strolled the gurney down the sidewalk into the back doors of the hospital. The hallways were similar to the nursing home, cold and fluorescent. I reached the morgue and pushed the button on the box near the door. This would summon the security guard who would have to sign me in and out. He arrived a few minutes later, looking tired and bored. He made a witty comment about death and let me into the morgue. It was a small room with 4 slide-out drawer coolers. It was equipped for medical procedures such as embalming and autopsies. I signed some paperwork and then placed an ankle ID tag on the corpse. I had made note of the personal effects that had been placed in a bag by the hospital staff. This body was placed in a body bag, as was customary for most hospital deaths. I did not ever find out the story on the guy I was picking up. He was young, probably late 40s. I wheeled him out to the van to be joined with the other deceased. It was time to head back to the funeral home and drop these 2 off so I could get back home and get back to bed. I had to be at the funeral home at 7:30 a.m. the next morning. It would come all too fast. I was less than half a mile from the funeral home, stopped at a stoplight when I noticed in my rearview mirror a car coming very fast toward me. I thought the car would most likely hit me, so I turned my wheels to face the grass embankment to the right. Sure enough, the car hit my van from behind at 45 miles an hour. The van launched onto the grass and hit a small tree. The bodies, still on their gurneys, had thrust forward and hit the dividing gate between me and them. I was a bit dazed from the impact and sat in the van for a few moments gathering my thoughts. The other car, now totaled, leaking some fluid on the pavement and smoking, was sitting in the middle of the street. Just then, my cell phone rings again. I answer. Another body to be picked up, This time it's a house call. Someone died in their home. I wrote down the information and hung up. I stepped out of the van to see if the other driver was still alive or hurt. She was dazed, but doing fine. Now standing, crying in the streets, I had very little sympathy for her. She had been speeding, not paying attention, and appeared to be an idiot. I called 911. The police, fire, and ambulance were on their way. I could instantly hear the sirens approaching us. I then called my backup removal team member. I told him I had been in a crash and that he would have to resume my night shift. I gave him the information on the house call. I then called my supervisor, who was surprised to be called at home at 3 o'clock in the morning. He said he only lived a few minutes away and would come to the crash scene. The fire department and the police arrived. I told them who I was and that there were 2 dead bodies in the van. They laughed. They said that they didn't realize that this was a crash with fatalities. Once my supervisor arrived, we had to devise a plan for getting the bodies out of the van. The rear door had been mangled and wouldn't open. The only option was to get the bodies out of the side door, but that meant taking the bodies off the gurney and maneuvering them out. This was not easy. After a while of working on this, we managed to get the bodies out. We took them to the funeral home prep room and checked the bodies to see if they had any signs of having been in this crash. We were hoping they did not, since we did not want to have to explain to their families that, though they died peacefully in their sleep, they were in a car crash and their bodies would not be able to be viewed. They were fine, and we did not ever have to tell the families their loved ones had been in a crash. Busted ankles. My partner and I drove down the quiet neighborhood street in our unmarked navy blue van. We had left the funeral home about 20 minutes earlier after being given a house call assignment from our supervisor. A house call was an event that would include picking up the deceased body from a residence. It could be tricky since the person could have expired in a variety of hard-to-get places within the home. Often we'd find them laying in their bed, or oftentimes laid out on the floor after having collapsed from some unexpected ailments such as a heart attack. We did not have any reason to believe this assignment would be any more difficult than any other house call, but we became suspicious that something was up when we saw a police car parked in front of the home and 2 officers waiting outside. It was not uncommon to have a police officer on the scene of a death that occurred in the home. They often would wait for us to arrive and promptly leave upon seeing our van drive up. Something seemed different about this case. The officers met us at the van with a dazed look on their face. They said, "You don't want to go in there without a mask." Officers were generally experienced in situations involving death and nothing ever seemed to faze them. But these 2 looked as though they were ready to vomit at the slightest provocation. "There's a cat in the house, seems to be the lady's pet. We'll call the animal control. The lady has been here, we suspect, for about 3 days. She's in the bathroom." With that information, the cops got in their cruiser and left. My partner looked at me and we non-verbally agreed that we needed masks. Like a reflex, we opened the back van door and rummaged through our stash of emergency protective clothing. We found our masks, which had been specifically fitted for our faces, designed to keep out the most horrific smells or fumes that might be in the air. Luckily, those masks, well, they worked very well. We went in the house. It had been lived in by an elderly lady who had, as the officers indicated, a cat, perhaps more than one. The house was dark with thick avocado and mustard yellow drapes drawn. The kitchen was a mess, outfitted with all the best 1970s had to offer in appliances. The carpet, a green shag, was worn with time and covered in pet hair. We slowly walked down the narrow hallway toward the bathroom. The door was locked. My partner looked at me as if to say, "Here goes." As we slowly opened the door, inside we found about an inch of sitting water in the floor, caused by some sort of toilet overflow. On the toilet sat the deceased, her mouth agape and her milky eyes staring straight ahead. She was slumped slightly to her right toward the bathtub. She was perhaps in her late 70s or early 80s. The bathroom was very small, even for one person. The officer's assessment was correct. The lady had probably been dead for about 3 days. With no family around to know, a neighbor had called the police after noticing her newspapers collecting in the driveway and hearing the moan of her cat from inside. The dilemma we faced was tricky. Most of her blood had collected in her feet and ankles, having been sitting upright for 3 days with no circulation. Her thin skin would most likely give way at the slightest movement of her body. We would have a huge mess on our hands if we were not careful. My partner and I went back to our van to assemble a plan of action. Our task was to remove her body by placing it in a body bag and on the gurney. There was no room on the floor of the bathroom to lay out a body bag and place her inside. We would have to somehow pick her up and carry her out, down the hallway and into the living room in order to place her in the body bag. But how would we do it without getting blood and body fluid all over the house and ourselves? My partner, who was currently in school to become a criminologist, was not one's idea of a funeral home removal staff worker. He was in his mid-20s, with designer glasses and a clean-cut hairstyle. He looked very studious and smart, and in fact he was. Often quiet, he was confident and in control. I was glad to have him on the job with me. The others on our staff would wanted to make crude jokes of our outlandish exclamations about the situation. We would have spent much of our time talking about how gross it was and how we didn't want to touch her rather than just getting the job done. My partner, though disgusted, was level-headed and had ideas of how to get the woman off the toilet and into the body bag. Now, the plan was for one of us to get on the right side of her and the other on the left, and we gently lift her from under her arms and carry her out the door. We could not hold her by her legs in fear of them falling apart. This sounds exaggerated, I know, but it was a valid fear. We set the gurney up in the living room. The gray body bag was placed on the floor and unzipped. Would it hold the blood and fluid sure to seep out? Probably not. But we could always double bag her if needed. We put on protective gear over our clothes and shoes. Our masks were placed in where we were on our way into the bathroom. We had discussed the need to move very slow and gentle so that her legs and feet would not gush open. I had got on the left between the bathtub and the body. My partner got on the right, and with a visual cue, we both gently lifted. It was only a few seconds before we noticed blood and fluid rising up past the soles of our protected shoes. Her ankles had busted. There was nothing left to do to prevent it. Blood and fluid filled the entire bathroom floor. We quickly moved her out into the hallway and into the living room. Her body was frail and the skin was literally peeling off in our hands. We had made a mess of the house, but it was something we could not avoid. The entire task took us about an hour. We slowly removed the soil protective wear at the rear of the van, being careful not to touch any of that fluid, blood, or skin that had attached itself to the material. On the way back to the funeral home, I realized that my partner and I had not spoken many words the entire time during the removal. We had been communicating with eye contact and nods only. Most likely, we did not want to open our mouths and intake any of that putrid air that surrounded us, even though we had our masks protecting us. Now, I cannot remember what we did about the required ankle tag we were supposed to place on the body. I'm guessing we just put it on a wrist. Lives cut short. Anytime a call came in from the city medical examiner's office for a body pickup, we knew it would be bad. People normally were taken to the EME who had been murdered or in a car accident. My first ME pickup was a mess. It was a car accident victim, a 19-year-old male and his 21-year-old girlfriend. Both had been severely beaten up in the high-speed wreck. I pulled the van into the dimly lit ME garage. Once I was in, the garage door closed so that the public could not see the horrific sight that would transpire. I entered through the glass double doors leading into my ME morgue. A large man wearing bloody scrubs, rubber gloves, and a surgeon's mask came in with a clipboard. "Hi, are you from the funeral home?" "Yes," I replied. I haven't seen you before. You must be new." "I'm Tom," he said. I was glad he did not extend his hand for a friendly handshake. Though I too had on rubber gloves, I did not care to shake his bloody hand. "Let me get the personal effects. I'll be right back," Tom said as he disappeared behind the door that said ME office. The bodies, both on the gurneys and in body bags, were to my left awaiting their trip to the funeral home. I had been trained that no matter how grotesque and mangled a body was, I would be required to unzip the body bag, locate the foot, and compare the ID numbers on my paperwork with the ID on their tag. Then, I would be required to attach another tag with the funeral home ID number, which would be a different number. I would prepare the tags before arriving on scene at the removal so that the removal could be done as quickly as possible. The body bags in the case were white. Though the zippers were closed, they were bloody, which meant that inside of the body bag would most likely be a mess. It was not only the car wreck that had caused the mess, but the autopsy that had been performed at the ME. Autopsies were standard in accidents and murders, and always included the opening of the chest cavity, which often could be re-sewn shut, but never cleaned up. I unzipped the first bag. The smell was horrific. It smelled mostly of blood and body fluid. The bodies had not yet began to smell of decomposition, but the smells were very gross. My gag reflexes engaged as I tried to keep from throwing up. I was glad the ME was in the other room. I imagine he would have made fun of me if he had seen me dry heave. Unfortunately, the body bag had to be completely unzipped for me to find the foot. I located the guy's foot, which was attached to the mangled leg that had been broken in 3 places. I attached the ankle tag quickly and re-zipped the bag. Now, my rubber gloves were bloody as hell. I moved over to the second body, unzipped the bag, located the ankle and attached the tag. The girlfriend's leg was not as badly damaged as her boyfriend's, but her face was severely damaged. The ME came out of the office with 2 plastic Ziploc bags that were their personal items, a wallet, some jewelry, and a watch. These items would have to be documented once back at the funeral home so that they made it back to the family. I transferred the body bags onto my own gurneys and loaded them into the van. Upon arriving back at the funeral home, I was met in the parking lot by two of the embalmers, who looked like kids on Christmas morning. They had spoken to the funeral director about the victims and were excited that they would have about 8 hours of reconstructive work to do on the bodies to prepare them for the viewing. We rolled the gurneys in, and we immediately transferred them onto the embalming tables. Boyfriend and girlfriend, side by side for the last time. Kinda weird. The bodies were so badly mangled. I remember the embalmers placing broomsticks in their legs to give them shape and using a liquid gel that could be injected into the face with a syringe. The gel was kind of like Botox, and it would fill out features on the face that had deflated after the person died. This technique could make one look more the way they looked in life. I remember a lot of this being used on the car crash victims to make them look less banged up. The bruising on the face was covered generously with makeup. A current photograph of the victim was set up next to the embalming table to use as reference. Once these two were embalmed, they were back in my care as another removal staff person and I dressed them in their burial clothes and placed them into their caskets. Before the burial clothes could be put on, the bodies had to be dressed in plastic pants and shirt in the event that there would be some purging or leaking of the fluids during the funeral. This was common for victims whose bodies had been severely mangled and lots of embalming fluids and sewing had been done during the embalming process. The last thing a funeral director wanted was for the body to seep out fluids while the mourners were viewing the body. This could be a traumatic experience for the mourner, depending on who it was. It was sad to see these two lives cut short. I was sure to drive safely and slow for the next several weeks as I would recall the horrific events of careless driving. Though I never had any interactions with the family of these two, I know it was a sudden, tragic shock that rocked their lives. I did not envy their grief. Suicide cleanup. Suicide is a common occurrence in the US. It brings with it grief and confusion. But for a funeral home, it brings money. Let's face it, tragic deaths often are the ones that result in grand funerals. More people buy flowers, more people attend the services, and families tend to buy top dollar items to deal with the grief. Not all funeral homes capitalize on people's griefs and confusions, but to say that it never happens would be naive. One particular suicide I remember was a 44-year-old man who had recently gone through a divorce. He had fallen into a depression over his circumstances and decided to end his life. He chose a gun as his means of death and shot a bullet into his temple. After picking him up at the medical examiner's office, I rolled his gurney into the embalming room, met by an eager embalmer awaiting his chance to reconstruct the gunshot victim. We opened the body bag to see what was in store for us. His head, having a bullet gone through it, had cracked his skull, leaving his head deformed. There was not a large amount of blood, and the bullet hole was quite small, but the fact that his head was deformed would mean some reconstructive embalming would be required. I decided to stay late this day and watch as the embalmer worked on this guy. He began by normal means of thoroughly washing the body to remove all the blood and the chemicals used by the ME earlier in the day. I noticed the man had a beard. It was manicured and it was undoubtedly his look during life. So the beard would have to stay, maybe even be trimmed up a bit later for the public viewing. The goal was to make the man look as normal as possible to reduce the shock and sting of a unexpected suicide. We had been told he had a 9-year-old daughter who would be attending the funeral. The embalmer did not want his daughter to see him for the last time with a sunken head, a constant reminder of the way he died. After cleaning the body, the artery located around the collarbone was located as the embalmer, Ted, placed a large clear tube into the artery to drain the blood. It flowed out of the man quickly. Simultaneously, formaldehyde was being pumped into his veins with another tube that went into a vein located in his inner thigh. This process took a while, but eventually the man was drained and refilled with pink formaldehyde. Next, it was time to reconstruct the head. Ted took a scalpel and scored his head into sections, like you would an orange. The peeled back skin, like it was simply a hat the man was wearing. It reminded me very much of something you would see in a horror movie. It almost was as if it wasn't real, which is how I was able to watch without passing out. Finally, Ted located and revealed the man's skull, which was cracked in 3 places. Ted took a saw and cut the skull, removing it from the man's head. He took the skull pieces to the sink and washed them thoroughly. He then showed the marks on the inside of the skull, indicating that the bullet had entered the skull and ricocheted around before settling into the man's brain. The skull was now in 3 pieces and would have to be reshaped. Ted was not sure how he was going to do this exactly, but he began by carefully applying a superglue component to the 3 pieces, putting them back together. Next, he took some white gauze and wrapped the skull in gauze and applied a layer of glue over the gauze to give it strength. It was very much the way movie scene designers might reinforce a prop for a play. Once the skull was back in its original shape, we placed it back in the man's head and stuffed it with more gauze to give it more shape. He carefully sewed the head back together, hiding the sutures with the man's hair. Very creative. Ted told me that he needed to use the original skull and restore it so the man would look himself. If he had removed the skull and replaced it with a foreign object, the man might not look the same. Now it was time for makeup. This would be required to fill the hole in the man's temple as well as give him color and life, so his daughter's last image of him would not be too horrific. A putty was used to fill the hole in his head, and makeup was applied in the area. It was so well done that no one would have ever known where the bullet had gone into, even if they were to look real close. Finally, he was ready for dressing. I remember the suit as a gray pinstripe suit and a gray-blue tie. I dressed him and got him suited in his casket. It was an amazing transformation from a man I had picked up from the ME the day before. He looked normal again. The horror of the suicide was no longer visible with the blood and gore, but rather by a resting human body in a casket. I always wondered what his family thought when they looked at him in the casket. Were they mad? Were they hurt? Were they scared? Probably all the above. But at least they never had to see the horrible sight we saw. No one should have to see his or her loved ones in that way if it can be helped. Combating smells. It has been a while since I have written a blog. I guess I've been super busy or preoccupied with other things. I wanted to share a story about a product we often used in the prep room of the funeral home. It was a cinnamon scented air freshener. I do not know what the concoction was or the brand name, but I do know that this air freshener was no typical kind that could be bought in a local store. It was specifically made for areas like funeral homes. Why do we need it? Well, typically, when a body was embalmed and the natural smells of decay would disappear, Embalming, after all, stops natural decay and preserves a body. However, there are several times when a family would not want the body embalmed. Sometimes it was because of the expense. Sometimes it was for religious reasons. Sometimes it was because the body would soon be cremated and had no reason to be preserved. I remember one case when a family decided to forego embalming because of the expense. Typically, embalming was over $1,000, and there's no law or rule that says you have to have a body embalmed. The only law that requires embalming is when a body is to be flown in an airplane to another location. Funeral homes may make you believe embalming is required, but it's not. It is, however, a very good idea to embalm if you are planning to have a funeral service where the body of the deceased is present. Even with a closed casket, a decaying body can emit horrific smells. So, funeral directors often encourage embalming, not so much for the money, but more for the family's peace of mind and grieving experience. There were several times that I recall bodies not being embalmed. One that stands out is the story of a large fella who passed away unexpectedly and a bit young. Probably he was in his late 40s or even early 50s. He had been through a recent, nasty divorce, and his ex-wife was the primary family member involved in his funeral planning. We cannot confirm the reasons why she did not have him embalmed. It could have been due to the expense, or it could have been some type of sick revenge. I hope it was not the latter. The man, whom we had to dress in a dark pinstripe suit, was beginning to decay quickly. There were no visible signs at first of decay, but the smell grew increasingly worse throughout the few days that we were storing him in the prep room before his funeral. He stunk a lot. It got to the point where he was truly hard to be in the prep room due to his smell. That's when I discovered the high-powered cinnamon air spray. It was in a generic-looking, industrial-sized spray can. I sprayed it all around the prep room, and it did eliminate the smell for about 15 to 20 minutes. At that time, a quick respray would buy us more time. The funeral director pleaded with the family not to have the body present in the room during the funeral, but they insisted. So we had to spray the room before, during, and after the viewing and funeral service. There is no doubt that the family smelled the decaying man. Of all the horrible things a family has to go through after a death of a loved one, smelling their decaying body is not one to add to the list. That is why embalming is important. By the time the day arrived for the man's burial, his hands and neck, chin areas were beginning to turn dark. Nature was running its course. Without the embalming, there was nothing more to be done other than spray the area every few minutes with cinnamon spray. Well, monsters, did you find these stories amusing? I really hope you enjoyed them. If you'd like to hear more funeral stories, be sure to let me know in the comments. Also, if you would like to keep up with what's going on here on Yeah Man TV, be sure to check us out on Twitter at Yeah Man TV. Big shout out to you monsters out there. And if you haven't done so, be sure to subscribe and become a monster today. Well, like always, until next time.